I found out my irrigation water was missing on a Tuesday morning in late June, standing in my alfalfa field outside Bend, Oregon, watching the dry soil crack under the relentless sun. The ditch that had fed my property for over a century ran bone dry, and I knew immediately something was wrong because the water rights on this land predated Oregon statehood itself. My name is Warren Thorn, and I'd inherited this 20-acre farm from my grandfather 3 years ago. The property sat in what used to be pure agricultural land, but in the past decade, the Mountain View Estates development had sprung up along the eastern boundary of my property. Big houses, manicured lawns, and an HOA that seemed to think they owned the whole county. I'd had my share of run-ins with them over the years, mostly complaints about the smell of manure or the sound of my tractor at 7 in the morning, but this was different. This was serious. I followed the irrigation ditch northward, past the fence line that separated my working farm from the cookie-cutter mansions of Mountain View Estates. That's when I saw it. Someone had dug a new channel, deliberately redirecting my water flow into one of the HOA properties. The excavation was fresh, maybe a day or two old, and the water that should have been nourishing my crops was now flooding into an elaborate garden behind a house with beige siding and white trim. I climbed over the fence and walked up to the garden, where a middle-aged woman with a blonde bob haircut was directing 2 workers as they positioned river rocks around newly planted flower beds. The redirected water flowed through a series of decorative channels she'd created, feeding what looked like thousands of dollars worth of landscaping. "Excuse me," I called out, approaching the group. "That's my water you're using." The woman turned to face me, her expression immediately shifting from pleased to annoyed. She wore white capri pants and a coral-colored blouse with oversized sunglasses perched on her head. "Your water? I don't think so. This is community water that flows through the development." "No, madam. That's water from an irrigation ditch that's been serving my property since 1889. Someone dug that channel and redirected my water supply, and I need it put back immediately." She placed her hands on her hips and took a step toward me. "I'm Heather Jenkins, president of the Mountain View Estates HOA. That ditch runs along our property line, which makes it community property. I had it redirected to prevent flooding issues and to properly utilize a wasted resource." I felt my jaw clench. "Mrs. Jenkins, that water is allocated to my property through senior water rights. It's not community property, it's not wasted, and you've just committed water theft, which is a serious crime in Oregon." She laughed, actually laughed, and waved her hand dismissively. "Water theft, please. I think you're being a bit dramatic. This is 2026, not the Old West. We live in a civilized community with an HOA that has authority over land use in this area." "Your HOA has no authority over my property or my water rights," I said, keeping my voice level despite my rising anger. "I'm going to ask you one more time to stop using my water and fill in that channel you dug." Heather turned to the workers, who had stopped what they were doing to watch our exchange. "Please continue with the landscaping. Don't let this interruption bother you." She turned back to me with a tight smile. "Mr. Whatever your name is, I suggest you take this up with the HOA board if you have concerns. We meet the first Tuesday of every month, but I can tell you right now that we've done nothing wrong. That water was running along the border of our community, and we have every right to use it for the betterment of our residents." I pulled out my phone and took several photos of the redirected ditch, the garden, and Heather herself. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "Documenting evidence of water theft," I replied. "You're going to be hearing from my attorney." Her face flushed red. "Are you threatening me? Because I can call the police right now for trespassing. You're on HOA property without permission. I came onto this property because you stole my water, but I'm leaving now. Just know that this isn't over." As I walked back toward my property, I heard her call out, "You farmers think you can do whatever you want. This is a residential community now, and things are changing whether you like it or not." I didn't respond. I was too angry to trust what might come out of my mouth. Instead, I went straight home, pulled out the property documents my grandfather had left me, and started making phone calls. The first was to my regular attorney, Tom Henderson, who handled basic legal matters for me. After I explained the situation, he let out a low whistle. "Warren, this is outside my expertise. Water rights law in Oregon is incredibly complex, especially with rights that old. You need a specialist. Let me give you the number for Richard Mallory. He's the best water rights attorney in the state, based out of Portland, but he handles cases all over Oregon. If anyone can deal with this, it's him." I called Richard Mallory's office immediately. His secretary told me he was in court but would call me back before the end of the day. True to her word, my phone rang at 4:30 that afternoon. "Mr. Thorn, this is Richard Mallory. Tom Henderson gave me a brief overview of your situation. Tell me exactly what happened." I walked him through everything, from discovering the dry ditch to my confrontation with Heather Jenkins. He asked detailed questions about the location, the age of my water rights, and whether I had the original documentation. "I have the original water rights certificate from 1889, I told him. "My great-great-grandfather filed it when he first homesteaded the property. It's been renewed and updated over the years, and I have all that paperwork too." "Perfect. And you say this Heather Jenkins claimed the HOA has authority over the water because it runs along their property line?" "That's what she said. She also said they redirected it to prevent flooding and to use a wasted resource." Richard made a sound that might have been amusement or disgust. I couldn't tell which. "Mr. Thorn, water rights in Oregon are taken very seriously, and senior water rights like yours are about as ironclad as it gets. The fact that this woman, acting on behalf of an HOA, physically redirected an irrigation ditch without even attempting to negotiate or research the legal situation is mind-boggling. I'd like to take your case. Can you meet me tomorrow morning at your property? I want to see the situation firsthand and document everything." "Absolutely. What time? 9 o'clock work for you? I'll be there." That night I barely slept. I kept thinking about my alfalfa field, about the crops that needed water, about my grandfather who had worked this land for 50 years. He told me stories about water disputes when he was younger, about neighbors who tried to divert creeks and the legal battles that followed. "Water is life on a farm," he'd say. "Without it, you have nothing but dust." Richard Mallory arrived exactly at 9 the next morning, driving a silver Lexus that looked out of place on my gravel driveway. He was in his late 50s, with gray hair and sharp blue eyes, wearing jeans and a polo shirt rather than the suit I'd expected. He shook my hand with a firm grip. "Show me everything," he said. We walked the irrigation ditch from my property line all the way to where it had been diverted. Richard took photos with a professional camera, measured distances, and made notes on a tablet. When we reached the point where someone had dug the new channel, he spent a long time examining the excavation work. "This was done with machinery," he said. "Probably a small backhoe. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. Someone planned this, got equipment, and deliberately redirected your water supply." He looked toward Heather's garden, where the water still flowed freely. "Has the water been running like this since yesterday, all night, as far as I can tell?" "So she's had ample time to comply with your request to stop using the water, and she's chosen not to. That's going to work in our favor. He turned to me. Here's what's going to happen. Today, I'm going to file an emergency motion with the Deschutes County Circuit Court for a temporary restraining order and preliminary injunction. Given the age and priority of your water rights and the clear evidence of unauthorized diversion, I'm confident we'll get it. That will legally require her to stop using the water immediately and restore the original flow. If she violates it, she'll be in contempt of court. How long will that take? We should have a hearing within a few days. In the meantime, I'm also going to send a cease and desist letter to both Heather Jenkins personally and to the Mountain View Estates HOA. This puts them on formal notice that they're violating your water rights and opens them up to liability for damages. What kind of damages are we talking about? Richard looked at my alfalfa field, where the plants were already showing stress from the lack of water. That depends on how long this goes on and how much crop loss you suffer. But in Oregon, water rights violations can also carry statutory damages and penalties. If we can prove they acted willfully and maliciously, which seems likely given that you confronted Mrs. Jenkins and she refused to stop, those penalties can be substantial. We spent another hour going over my water rights documentation. Richard was impressed with how complete my records were, including the original 1889 certificate, the subsequent renewals, and recent surveys showing the exact path of the irrigation ditch. Your grandfather kept excellent records, he said. This is going to make our case much stronger. After Richard left, I tried to focus on other farm work, but my attention kept drifting back to that dry irrigation ditch. I decided to check on Heather's property again, just to see if anything had changed. It hadn't. If anything, the water flow seemed stronger, and I could see her in the garden again, this time showing off her new landscaping to two other women who I assumed were neighbors. I stayed on my side of the fence this time, but I watched for a few minutes. The garden really was impressive, I had to admit. Heather had created multiple levels with stone terraces, and the redirected water flowed through it in a series of small waterfalls and pools. She'd planted everything from roses to ornamental grasses, and the whole setup probably cost more than my truck. She noticed me watching and said something to her friends. All three of them turned to stare at me, and then Heather pulled out her phone. 5 minutes later, a sheriff's deputy pulled up to my property. Deputy Martinez was someone I knew slightly from town. He approached me with a neutral expression. "Warren, I got a call about someone harassing the residents of Mountain View Estates." That would be Heather Jenkins calling about me, I assume. She said you've been watching her property and taking photos without permission. I explained the entire situation, including the water theft and my meeting with Richard Mallory that morning. Martinez listened carefully, taking notes. "So you're saying that irrigation ditch is yours and she redirected it? Not just mine. The water rights are attached to my property, going back to 1889. She committed water theft, which is a crime in Oregon." Martinez looked at the dry ditch, then at the new channel flowing into Heather's property. "I'm not going to lie, Warren. This is outside my area of expertise. Water rights are usually civil matters unless there's clear criminal intent. But from what you're describing, it sounds like you have a legitimate grievance. You said you hired an attorney, Richard Mallory. He's filing for an emergency injunction. Okay, I'd suggest you let the legal process work and avoid any direct confrontation with Mrs. Jenkins. I know it's frustrating, but if a judge orders her to restore the water flow, that'll carry a lot more weight than anything I could do right now. I understand. But for the record, I wasn't harassing her. I was standing on my own property, looking at my water being stolen." Martinez nodded. I'll note that in my report. Try to stay patient, Warren. I know that's easier said than done. After the deputy left, I went back to the house and called Richard to tell him about the interaction. He didn't seem surprised. Classic intimidation tactic, he said. She's trying to paint you as the aggressor to deflect from her own actions. Don't worry about it. I've already filed the emergency motion, and we have a hearing scheduled for Friday morning at 10. That's faster than I expected, which tells me the judge recognizes the seriousness of the situation. Friday couldn't come fast enough. I spent the next 2 days watching my alfalfa wilt in the June heat while Heather's garden flourished with my water. I took photos every few hours to document the damage to my crops. Each time I checked, I got angrier. On Thursday afternoon, I received a letter from the Mountain View Estates HOA's attorney, a firm called Davidson and Associates. The letter claimed that the irrigation ditch in question ran through an easement that was part of the HOA's common area, and that the HOA had the right to manage water resources within their development to prevent flooding and ensure proper drainage. It demanded that I cease my harassment of Mrs. Jenkins and threatened legal action if I continued to make baseless accusations. I forwarded the letter to Richard immediately. He called me back within an hour, and he was laughing. "This is the sloppiest legal argument I've seen in months," he said. "They're confusing an easement with ownership, and they're completely ignoring the concept of water rights, which are separate from land ownership. No competent water rights attorney would have written this letter. I think they just grabbed their usual HOA attorney, someone who handles covenant disputes and parking violations, and he's way out of his depth. So we're still good for tomorrow. Better than good. This letter actually helps us because it shows the HOA is acting as an entity in this matter, which means we can pursue damages against their corporate assets and insurance. I'll see you at the courthouse at 9:30 tomorrow morning." I didn't sleep much Thursday night either. I kept rehearsing what I might need to say to the judge, reviewing the facts in my mind. My alarm went off at 6, but I was already awake. I fed the animals, did the minimum necessary chores, and then showered and put on the one suit I owned, the same one I'd worn to my grandfather's funeral. The Deschutes County Courthouse in Bend was a modern building with lots of glass and stone. I met Richard in the lobby at 9:30 as planned. He was wearing a sharp navy suit and carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than my entire outfit. "You ready?" he asked. "As ready as I'll ever be." We went through security and headed to the courtroom. Heather Jenkins was already there with her attorney, a young guy in his 30s who introduced himself as Brad Davidson. Heather was dressed like she was going to a country club, in a floral dress and heels. She looked at me with barely concealed contempt. The hearing was before Judge Patricia Whitmore, a woman in her 60s with short gray hair and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She reviewed the file for a few minutes before looking up. "Mr. Mallory, this is your motion. Please proceed." Richard stood and presented our case with the precision of a surgeon. He outlined the history of my water rights, presented the original 1889 certificate, showed photos of the irrigation ditch before and after the diversion, and documented the crop damage I'd already suffered. He was calm, factual, and utterly convincing. When he finished, Judge Whitmore turned to Brad Davidson. "Counsel, what's your response to this?" Davidson stood, looking considerably less confident than Richard. "Your Honor, the Mountain View Estates HOA disputes that Mr. Thorn has exclusive rights to this water. The irrigation ditch in question runs along the boundary of the HOA's property, and the HOA has an obligation to manage common areas for the benefit of all residents. Mrs. Jenkins, as HOA president, was acting within her authority to redirect water that was causing drainage issues and to put it to beneficial use. Judge Whitmore looked at him over her glasses. "Mr. Davidson, are you familiar with Oregon water rights law?" "I've reviewed the relevant statutes, Your Honor." "Then you should know that water rights in Oregon are based on prior appropriation. The principle is first in time, first in right. Mr. Thorn has presented a water rights certificate dating to 1889. Does your client have any water rights at all for this source?" Davidson shuffled through his papers. "Your Honor, we believe that the development's infrastructure includes water management systems that's not what I asked." "Does your client have a water rights certificate for this particular irrigation ditch?" "No, Your Honor. But then on what legal basis did Mrs. Jenkins redirect this water?" Davidson looked at Heather, who leaned forward and whispered something to him. He turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, Mrs. Jenkins believed in good faith that the water running along the HOA property line was available for community use. Ignorance of water rights is not a defense, Mr. Davidson. These rights are matters of public record." "Did anyone from the HOA research this before redirecting the ditch?" "I don't believe so, Your Honor." Judge Whitmore looked at Heather directly. "Mrs. Jenkins, is it true that Mr. Thorn confronted you about this water diversion on Tuesday, June 24th, and explicitly told you that he had water rights to this source?" Heather stood up, even though Davidson tried to motion her to stay seated. "Yes, Your Honor, but I thought he was just being difficult. The HOA has a responsibility to manage our community, and that water was just running through our property unused. I created a beautiful garden that enhances property values for everyone in Mountain View Estates." "And after Mr. Thorn informed you of his water rights, did you stop using the water?" Heather's face reddened. "No, Your Honor, I thought he was bluffing." "You thought he was bluffing about water rights that date back to 1889 and are recorded with the state?" "I didn't think it could possibly matter anymore. That was more than 100 years ago." Judge Whitmore removed her glasses and leaned back in her chair. "Mrs. Jenkins, water rights in Oregon don't expire because they're old. In fact, the opposite is true. Senior water rights have priority over junior rights always. What you've done is not just a civil matter. Water theft in Oregon can be a criminal offense under ORS 540.720. You've admitted in open court that you were informed of Mr. Thorn's water rights and chose to continue using the water anyway." The color drained from Heather's face. "Criminal." "But I didn't know. You just testified that Mr. Thorn told you about his rights on Tuesday, and you continued using the water for 3 more days. That's knowing and willful conduct." Judge Whitmore put her glasses back on and looked at Richard. "Mr. Mallory, I'm granting your motion for a preliminary injunction. Mrs. Jenkins and the Mountain View Estates HOA are hereby ordered to immediately cease all use of the irrigation water, restore the original flow of the ditch to Mr. Thorn's property, and fill in any channels or diversions they created. This must be completed within 24 hours. Failure to comply will result in contempt charges and daily fines of $1,000. She looked at Davidson. "Make sure your client understands this is a court order, not a suggestion." "Yes, Your Honor." "Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for review of potential criminal charges under Oregon's water theft statutes. Mrs. Jenkins, you may want to consult with a criminal defense attorney." Judge Whitmore signed the order and handed it to her clerk. "We're adjourned." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Richard shook my hand as we left the courtroom. That went better than I expected. Judge Whitmore clearly takes water rights seriously. Behind us, I could hear Heather's raised voice as she argued with Brad Davidson in the hallway. Criminal charges. You said this was just a property dispute. You said we'd win. We walked outside into the bright sunshine. What happens now? I asked Richard. Now they have 24 hours to restore your water. I'd suggest you inspect the ditch tomorrow morning to make sure they've complied. If they haven't, let me know immediately and we'll file for contempt. As for the criminal matter, that's up to the DA's office. They may or may not pursue charges, depending on how serious they think the offense was. And damages for my crops. That's the next phase. Once we have the preliminary injunction made permanent, we'll file for compensatory damages. I'll need you to document all your losses and get estimates for the full cost. We may also pursue punitive damages given Mrs. Jenkins's willful conduct. I drove home feeling better than I had in days. The next morning, Saturday, I walked the irrigation ditch at dawn. Someone had been there overnight. The channel into Heather's property had been filled in with dirt and sod, and the original ditch had been cleared of debris. Water was flowing again, exactly as it should. I stood there for a long moment, watching the water run through the ditch my great-great-grandfather had dug more than a century ago. The alfalfa was already starting to recover, the leaves perking up as the soil absorbed the moisture it desperately needed. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The following Tuesday, I received a notice that the Mountain View Estates HOA had called an emergency meeting, and that I was invited to attend to discuss the recent misunderstanding. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at the community center inside the development. I called Richard to ask if I should go. "It's up to you," he said. "You're not required to attend, but if you do go, don't say anything that could be used against you later. Stick to the facts, don't make threats, and don't accept any settlement offers without running them by me first." I decided to go. I wanted to see what they had to say. The Mountain View Estates Community Center was a lavish building with vaulted ceilings and expensive furniture. About 30 residents were there when I arrived, along with Heather Jenkins and the rest of the HOA board. The mood was hostile from the moment I walked in. Heather called the meeting to order. She was all business, her earlier panic apparently replaced with righteous indignation. "Thank you all for coming on short notice. As most of you know, we've had a situation with a neighboring property owner who has made legal threats against the HOA and forced us to discontinue a beautification project that would have benefited the entire community." I raised my hand. "That's not an accurate characterization of what happened." She ignored me. "The HOA spent over $15,000 on landscaping that has now been wasted because of these legal threats. We're exploring our options for recovering those costs." A man in the front row stood up. "Are you talking about suing this guy?" He turned to look at me. "You're the farmer, right?" "I am. And for the record, what Mrs. Jenkins calls legal threats was actually me defending my legal water rights that date back to 1889. The HOA redirected an irrigation ditch without permission or any legal right to do so." Another resident, a woman in her 40s, spoke up. "But doesn't the HOA have the right to manage common areas? That's what we pay dues for." "The irrigation ditch isn't in your common area," I said. "It runs along the property line, but the water itself is allocated to my property through senior water rights that predate this entire development by more than 100 years. What the HOA did was water theft, which is a crime in Oregon." Heather's face flushed red. "A crime? How dare you come into our community center and make such accusations?" "It's not an accusation. It's a fact. Judge Whitmore said the same thing in court and referred the matter to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges." The room erupted in conversations. Some people were clearly on Heather's side, but others looked concerned. A man in his 60s stood up. "Heather, is this true? Could you face criminal charges?" "It's a ridiculous overreaction by an activist judge," Heather snapped. "Water theft laws are meant for people who steal water during droughts, not for community improvement projects." "That's not how the law works," I said. "And it's definitely not what Judge Whitmore said. The law applies to anyone who uses water they don't have rights to, especially after being informed of someone else's rights." Another board member, a balding man named Roger, stood up. "Mr. Thorn, we understand you're upset, but surely we can reach some kind of agreement. What if the HOA compensates you for the water usage? We could work out a rate." "You can't buy water rights you don't have," I said. "The water is allocated to my property for agricultural use. That's not negotiable." "Everything is negotiable," Heather said coldly. "The reality is that this community represents progress and growth, while your farm is a remnant of the past. Deschutes County is changing, and you need to change with it." I felt my temper rising but kept my voice level. "My water rights don't disappear because you don't like farms. Those rights are protected by law, and Judge Whitmore made it very clear that they take priority over your landscaping projects." A younger woman in the back spoke up. "I'm confused. If Mr. Thorn has legal rights to this water, why are we even having this meeting? Shouldn't we just accept the court's decision and move on?" Heather glared at her. "We're having this meeting because the HOA has a responsibility to explore all options for protecting community interests. That includes potential appeals." "You can appeal all you want," I said. "But in the meantime, you need to comply with the court order. And you might want to talk to a better attorney because Brad Davidson clearly didn't understand water rights law." "Our attorney is perfectly competent," Heather said, "and we will absolutely be appealing this decision. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if we file a counterclaim for the harassment and emotional distress you've caused. Richard had warned me about this tactic. Good luck with that. I have a court order in my favor, photos documenting everything, and your own admission in court that you continued using the water even after I told you about my rights. Any counterclaim you file will be dismissed, and you'll just rack up more legal fees." Roger tried to play peacemaker again. "Let's everyone calm down. Mr. Thorn, would you be willing to meet with the board privately to discuss a possible resolution?" "If my attorney is present, yes, but I'm not agreeing to anything that compromises my water rights." The meeting went on for another hour, with residents arguing among themselves about whether the HOA should fight or settle. I left when it became clear that Heather had no intention of backing down. She was determined to portray herself as a victim and me as an unreasonable bully. 2 weeks later, Richard called with news. "The DA's office has decided to file charges. Heather Jenkins is being charged with 1 count of water theft under ORS 540.720. It's a misdemeanor, but it carries potential jail time and fines up to $10,000. Wow. I didn't think they'd actually do it." Judge Whitmore's referral carried weight, and the DA reviewed all the evidence. "The fact that you confronted Mrs. Jenkins, explicitly told her about your water rights, and she continued using the water anyway made it an easy decision. That shows willful intent. What happens now? She'll be arraigned, and she'll probably plead not guilty. There'll be a trial unless she takes a plea deal. This is separate from our civil case, but it definitely strengthens our position for damages." The news of the criminal charges spread through Mountain View Estates like wildfire. I heard through mutual acquaintances that there was a movement to recall Heather from the HOA board, led by residents who didn't want the community associated with criminal activity. The landscaping in her garden had started to die without the irrigation water, leaving brown patches among the expensive plants. In August, I received notice that the HOA was dropping their appeal and wanted to discuss a settlement. Richard and I met with their new attorney, a woman named Patricia Wu, who actually specialized in water rights. My clients acknowledged that they were in the wrong, Patricia said at the meeting. They want to make this right and avoid further legal expenses. We're prepared to offer compensation for crop damages and legal fees. Richard had prepared a detailed accounting. Mr. Thorn lost approximately $8,000 in alfalfa production due to the 4-day water shutoff. His legal fees to date are $12,000. In addition, we're seeking $25,000 in punitive damages based on Mrs. Jenkins's willful and malicious conduct. Patricia winced. $45,000 total. That's going to require a special assessment on all HOA members. That's not my client's problem, Richard said. Your client stole his water, ignored a direct request to stop, and forced him to seek legal relief. These are the consequences. After some negotiation, they agreed to pay $40,000, with $35,000 coming from the HOA's reserves and insurance, and $5,000 coming from Heather Jenkins personally. The settlement included a permanent injunction preventing any future interference with my water rights, and a written acknowledgement from the HOA that my water rights were valid and superior to any claims they might have. The criminal case against Heather went to trial in October. I had to testify about our initial confrontation and her refusal to stop using the water. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before finding her guilty. The judge sentenced her to 30 days in jail, suspended pending 1 year of probation, a $5,000 fine, and 100 hours of community service. She was also ordered to take a course on Oregon water law. I was in the courtroom when the verdict was read. Heather looked stunned, as if she couldn't believe this was actually happening to her. Her husband, a quiet man who I'd never seen before, put his arm around her shoulders as they left. By November, Heather had resigned from the HOA board. The new president was a reasonable guy named Tom who introduced himself at the feed store one day and apologized for everything that had happened. Most of us just want to live in peace and raise our families, he said. Heather let the power go to her head and she dragged the whole community into her mess. I'm sorry you had to deal with that. I appreciate that, I said. I've got nothing against your community. I just need my water to run my farm. Understood? If anything like this ever comes up again, come talk to me first. We'll work it out like neighbors should. I took the settlement money and used it to upgrade my irrigation system, installing more efficient sprinklers and a backup water storage tank in case of future disruptions. The alfalfa came back strong after the incident, and I ended up with a decent harvest despite the temporary setback. The following spring, I was working in the field when I saw someone approaching from the Mountain View Estates side. It was Heather, wearing jeans and a simple t-shirt instead of her usual expensive outfits. She looked older, tired. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" she asked, staying on her side of the fence. I walked over, curious. "What's on your mind?" "I owe you an apology," she said, not meeting my eyes. "A real one, not the court-ordered kind. I was wrong about everything. I thought because I was HOA president that I could just decide how things should be. I didn't respect your property rights or your livelihood, and I nearly destroyed everything I cared about because of my arrogance." I didn't say anything, just waited. The criminal conviction cost me my position on the board, most of my friends in the community, and my marriage. My husband and I are getting divorced. He couldn't deal with the shame of being married to a convicted criminal. She laughed bitterly. Over an irrigation ditch. I destroyed my whole life over an irrigation ditch. Why are you telling me this? because you deserve to know that you were right and I was wrong. And because I'm moving away next month back to California where I came from, and I wanted to clear my conscience before I go." She finally looked up at me. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to know that I understand now what I did to you and I'm sorry." I studied her face, seeing genuine remorse there. "I accept your apology, and for what it's worth, I'm sorry your life fell apart. That wasn't what I wanted. I just wanted my water back." "I know. That's what makes it worse. You weren't trying to ruin me. You were just defending what was yours. I'm the one who turned it into a war." She turned to go, then stopped. "Your grandfather would be proud of how you fought for this place. I did some research after the trial, learned about the history of your property. It's a good legacy you're protecting." After she left, I stood there for a while thinking about everything that had happened. The whole situation had been crazy and unnecessary, but it had taught me something important about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. That summer, I got a letter from the new HOA board asking if I'd be willing to give a presentation at one of their meetings about farming in Central Oregon and the importance of water rights. They wanted their residents to understand the agricultural heritage of the area and how to be better neighbors to working farms. I agreed, and on a warm July evening, I stood in front of 50 Mountain View Estates residents and talked about my great-great-grandfather homesteading the land in 1889, about the irrigation systems that turned the high desert into productive farmland, and about the careful legal framework that governed water use in a state where water was always scarce. People asked good questions. A few teenagers were there for a school project about local history, and they were fascinated by the old photos I brought of the farm from different decades. One kid asked if he could interview me for his history paper, and I said yes. After the presentation, several residents came up to thank me and to say they were glad we'd worked things out. Tom, the new HOA president, shook my hand. "This is what community should be about," he said, "understanding each other and finding ways to coexist." I went home that night feeling good about the future. The bad blood between my farm and Mountain View Estates seemed to be healing. People were starting to see my property as part of the community's heritage rather than an eyesore to be eliminated. In September, almost a year after the initial incident, I was inspecting the irrigation ditch when I found a hand-painted sign someone had placed near the property line. It read, "Historic irrigation ditch serving Central Oregon since 1889. Please respect water rights." I later found out that the teenagers from the History Project had researched Oregon water law and convinced the HOA to install informational signs about the agricultural history of the area. There were 3 signs total, placed at different points along the fence line, each one explaining something about water rights or farming history. It was a small thing, but it meant a lot. It meant people understood now. It meant my fight hadn't just been about protecting my own interests, but about educating a community that had lost touch with its roots. The legal battle had cost me time, money, and stress, but in the end, it had resulted in something positive. The HOA had new leadership that respected property rights. The community had learned about water law and agricultural heritage. And I had proven that even in 2026, even with suburban sprawl changing the landscape, the old rights still mattered and would be enforced. My grandfather used to say that farming was about more than just growing crops. It was about being a steward of the land, preserving it for future generations. By fighting for my water rights, I'd done exactly that. I'd protected not just my own farm, but the principle that these historic allocations couldn't simply be taken by someone who decided they had a better use for them. As autumn arrived and I prepared for the final alfalfa cutting of the season, I looked out over the fields that had been in my family for 5 generations. The irrigation ditch ran clear and strong, just as it had for more than a century. My water rights were secure, documented, and respected. Heather Jenkins had moved away, the HOA had paid the settlement, and life had returned to normal. But the lessons remained. Water is life in the high desert. Rights matter. And sometimes you have to fight to protect what's yours, even when the fight seems unwinnable. The story could have ended there, but life rarely ties up that neatly. In late November, I received a certified letter from Patricia Wu, the water rights attorney who had represented the HOA in the settlement negotiations. She was writing to inform me that she'd been contacted by a developer who was considering purchasing a large tract of land north of my property and wanted to understand the water rights situation in the area. "Given your experience with the Mountain View Estates HOA," she wrote, "I thought you might appreciate a heads up that development pressure in your area is likely to increase. I've advised the developer that they need to conduct thorough due diligence on all water rights before proceeding with any plans. Your case has become something of a cautionary tale in local real estate circles. I appreciated the warning. It reminded me that my fight with Heather hadn't been an isolated incident, but rather a symptom of larger changes happening across Central Oregon. As more people moved to the area, as agriculture gave way to residential development, conflicts over water and land use were inevitable. But I was prepared now. I had the best water rights attorney in the state on speed dial. I had documentation that had been tested in court, and I had a community of neighbors who, after learning the hard way, understood the importance of respecting established rights. One December morning, I was having coffee in town when Brad Davidson, the original HOA attorney who had handled the case so poorly, sat down at the table next to me. He recognized me and had the grace to look embarrassed. "Mr. Thorn," he said, "I owe you an apology too. I took that case thinking it was just another HOA dispute, and I didn't do proper research. I've since taken several courses on Oregon water law, and I understand now how badly I mishandled the situation." "I appreciate you saying that," I said. "We all make mistakes. The question is whether we learn from them. I definitely learned from this one. I've actually started referring all water rights cases to specialists now. I stick to what I know: covenant enforcement, architectural review disputes, that kind of thing." He paused. "For what it's worth, I feel terrible about how things went down. Mrs. Jenkins was so convinced she was right that she steamrolled over my concerns, and I should have pushed back harder. She paid the price for her arrogance," I said. "We all did in different ways." After he left, I thought about all the different people whose lives had been affected by one woman's decision to redirect an irrigation ditch. Heather had lost her position, her reputation, her marriage, and her home. The HOA had paid $40,000 and faced community division. I'd lost crops and sleep, and time I could have spent doing productive work. And Brad Davidson had learned a painful lesson about the limits of his expertise. All of it could have been avoided if Heather had done 5 minutes of research before acting, or if she'd listened when I first explained the situation, or if she'd shown any willingness to acknowledge that she might be wrong. Pride and ignorance are a dangerous combination, especially when it comes to property rights and natural resources. Western water law exists because the early settlers understood that, in an arid climate, clear rules about water allocation were essential to prevent conflicts and violence. Those rules had served the region well for more than a century, and they would continue to serve it as long as people respected them. As winter settled over the farm and the irrigation season ended, I took time to reflect on everything that had happened. The fields lay dormant under occasional snow, resting and recovering for the next growing season. The irrigation ditch still flowed, though at a reduced winter rate, carrying water that had sustained this land since before Oregon was a state. I thought about my great-great-grandfather, arriving in this harsh landscape with nothing but determination and a willingness to work. He'd filed his water claim, dug his ditch, and built something that would last. 4 generations later, his descendant had fought to protect what he'd created, using the same legal framework he'd relied on in 1889. That continuity meant something. It represented stability, rule of law, and respect for property rights that transcended individual ownership. I was the current steward of this land, but I wouldn't be the last. Someday, if I had kids, or if I sold to someone who valued what the property represented, someone else would stand where I stood and watch water flow through that ancient ditch. The whole experience with Heather and the HOA had reminded me why these battles matter. It's not just about one person's crops or one season's harvest. It's about maintaining the systems that allow agriculture to exist in challenging environments. It's about honoring the work of those who came before and protecting the resources for those who come after. On Christmas Eve, I was surprised to receive a card from Heather. It was postmarked from Sacramento and contained a short handwritten note. "I hope you and your farm have a peaceful holiday season. I'm starting over here, trying to be a better person. Thank you for accepting my apology. It meant more than you know." I put the card on my refrigerator, next to photos of my grandfather on his tractor and my great-grandmother in front of the old farmhouse. Even people who make terrible mistakes deserve a chance at redemption, I figured. Heather had paid a heavy price for her actions, and she seemed to be genuinely trying to learn from the experience. The new year brought new challenges, as years always do on a farm. Equipment broke down, weather patterns were unpredictable, and markets fluctuated. But through it all, the irrigation ditch kept flowing, carrying the water that made everything else possible. In February, I attended a regional farming conference in Redmond and ended up having dinner with Richard Mallory, who was there to give a presentation on water rights. Over steak and local beer, we talked about the case and its aftermath. "You know your case is being taught in law schools now," Richard said. "I've had 3 professors contact me for permission to use it in their water rights courses." It's a perfect example of how ancient water rights interact with modern development and how not to handle a dispute if you're an HOA, I laughed. So Heather's mistake is educating future lawyers. At least something good came out of it. "A lot of good came out of it," Richard said. "Your community learned to respect water rights. The HOA got better leadership, and you established clear precedent that'll protect your farm for years to come. Plus, you got compensated for your losses. As far as these things go, that's about as good an outcome as you could hope for." He was right. The situation had resolved about as well as possible, given how badly it had started. I had my water, my compensation, and my peace of mind. The farm was secure, and my relationship with the neighboring community was actually better than it had been before the whole mess started. As spring approached, and I prepared for another growing season, I received one more unexpected piece of news. Tom, the new HOA president, called to tell me that Mountain View Estates had updated their CC and Articles, covenants, conditions, and restrictions to include explicit language about respecting neighboring property rights, particularly regarding water resources. New homeowners would have to sign an acknowledgement that they understood these provisions before closing on their properties. "We want to make sure nothing like last year's situation ever happens again," Tom explained. The whole community was embarrassed by how Heather acted, and we want to be good neighbors going forward. I thanked him for the call and for the HOA's proactive approach. It was exactly the kind of institutional change that could prevent future conflicts. That spring, as the alfalfa came up green and strong, nourished by water flowing through the irrigation ditch my great-great-grandfather had dug, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. I'd fought for my rights and won. I'd protected my family's legacy. And I'd helped educate a community about the importance of respecting the systems that allow agriculture to thrive in the high desert. The farm would continue. The water would flow. And future generations would benefit from the precedent that had been set when one farmer stood up to an HOA Karen, who thought she could redirect an irrigation ditch into her garden. My water rights attorney had indeed fixed the problem, but the real victory was in the lessons learned and the relationships rebuilt in the aftermath. Standing in my field on a bright April morning, watching the sprinklers distribute water across the emerging crop, I thought about all the people who had fought similar battles over the past century and a half. Water disputes were nothing new in the West. What mattered was that the legal framework existed to resolve them fairly, and that people were willing to stand up for their rights when those rights were threatened. Heather Jenkins had learned that lesson the hard way, at great personal cost. But in learning it, she'd inadvertently strengthened the very system she'd tried to ignore. The publicity from the case, the educational efforts that followed, and the changes to HOA governance all served to reinforce the importance of water rights in a region where water would always be precious. My grandfather would have been proud. He'd always said that farming required not just hard work, but also the courage to defend what was yours. I'd done both, and in doing so, I'd secured the future of a farm that had survived droughts, economic depressions, world wars, and now suburban encroachment. The irrigation ditch would keep flowing, carrying water allocated in 1889 to crops planted in 2027 and beyond. That continuity, that connection between past and future, was worth fighting for. And thanks to Oregon's strong water rights laws and Judge Patricia Whitmore's clear understanding of those laws, the fight had ended the right way. As I headed back to the barn to start the day's work, I took one last look at the water flowing peacefully through the ancient ditch. It sparkled in the morning sun, indifferent to all the human drama that had surrounded it. Water doesn't care about HOAs or legal battles or property disputes. It just flows where it's directed, following the path of least resistance. But the people who depend on that water care very much indeed. And as long as there are farmers willing to defend their water rights, and attorneys like Richard Mallory willing to help them do it, and judges like Patricia Whitmore willing to enforce the law, those rights will continue to mean something. The story of my battle with Heather Jenkins and the Mountain View Estates HOA was over, but the story of the farm continued. It would continue as long as water flowed through that ditch, as long as crops grew in the fields, and as long as someone cared enough to protect what 5 generations had built. And I cared. I cared enough to fight when necessary, to educate when possible, and to be a good steward of the land and water entrusted to me. That was the real legacy my grandfather had left me, and it was the legacy I would pass on to whoever came after me. The sun climbed higher, warming the spring air. There was work to be done, crops to plant, equipment to maintain. But for just a moment, I allowed myself to appreciate the simple fact that my water was flowing where it should be, my rights were secure, and my farm was safe. Sometimes that's all a farmer can ask for, and it's everything that matters.